Just so you know where you are. Sessions dealing with management interventions, their implementation, evaluation, effectiveness. We've got a great diversity of talks from the icy waters of Canada to the sunny impoundments of Queensland. So speakers can have the stage for 15 minutes, and if talks finish before that time, then we can move into questions straight away to fill the void. I want to remind you all that we have the panel Q&A at the end of the session. Because we've got 2 free slots at the end of this first session, I'm going to carry that over to have one big Q&A at the end of the second session this afternoon. So I'd ask the speakers to return for that final Q&A. And depending on the mood in the room, we can start that process at the end of the talk here. We'll see how it goes. So we might get started now. I'll call Andrew to the stage from Carleton University. Is going to talk to us about managing Canadian freshwater fisheries. Thanks, Andrew.
Thank you. Yeah, so I'm going to talk to you guys about managing Canadian freshwater fisheries and some of the persistent challenges therein. Can I just click to change slide here? Or is... Oh, okay, gotcha. Right, so to state the obvious, freshwater fisheries and biodiversity aren't doing so great. This is a global problem. We can tell by comparisons to marine and terrestrial biodiversity that this is the case. It's not only the case globally, it's the case in Canada too. We've seen a variety of things in Canada, among them invisible fisheries collapses. We forecasted the effects of climate change, and those don't look so good. And at a national policy level, we haven't paid, it seems, sufficient attention to our freshwater fisheries. By a show of hands, how many people have heard the term wicked problem or wild problem or any variation of that? Okay, good. So mainly what I want to do today is give some context to this or provide some examples of this in Canadian freshwater fisheries management, which I think should resonate with others in Australian countries that probably have pretty similar problems. So this is part of the impetus for my work, is the recognition that beyond advocacy, basic science, and more conventional problem-solving methods, there's a bit of a gap, and my work and the work of others is, partially a response to that. So at least the work I'm presenting today, the response to this involved a national survey of freshwater fisheries practitioners in Canada. I could use the term manager because, that obviously to some people includes a lot, but in this case, the whole criteria was individuals who were in some way contributing to freshwater fisheries management, but were just intimately familiar with, the process and more specifically the really difficult challenges therein. So I interviewed 50 managers from across the country for an average of roughly an hour, and I also asked some basic closed questions, and by combining the very basic quantitative data I got with qualitative analyses that I did on those extended interviews, we were able to see some patterns and then go in and on those individual parts, really understand them deeply. And the idea here is to gain depth of insight and depth of understanding on these things so we can intervene effectively, hopefully. The other thing I'll mention, you'll see that there's some big differences in job titles across the individuals we interviewed, and this has mostly to do with semantic, structural, and operational differences across provinces. And when we look at our respondent demographics, we have some pretty good indications that we got what we were looking for, which was key informants, people who could really speak with authority on these ultimately complex issues in fisheries management. Again, some basic quantitative data, just stuff that we compared with our qualitative data analyses to really not only see broadly, but more importantly, deeply. The main products of this were what I'm taken to call persistent and innate challenges. And for each one of these, I came up with some what I'm calling grains of opportunity. So these are the little areas and types of work that I see as opportunities to overcome these big, wicked problems. So the first one, and I'll explain first, 192 segments just refers to the total number of mentions of each one of these problems. 48 cases means 48 out of the 50 people I interviewed brought this up. So bureaucratic sprawl, it refers to all of the inefficiencies and the messy little aspects of bureaucracy that make managing effectively a difficult thing. So this came up again and again, as you might imagine, and there's some opportunity, even though this and some of the other persistent challenges are largely beyond the purview of freshwater fisheries managers. There's opportunities for progress, and in this case they relate to, again, eliminating some of those inefficiencies, but also things like variation orders that allow, in Canada, provinces to change regulations more swiftly, extending these to others and essentially making a more responsive and efficient management system. One thing I'll mention before I go any further is that part of the reason I present this at WRFC is because in Canada, freshwater fisheries management is somewhat synonymous with recreational fisheries management. We have some significant commercial and indigenous inland fisheries for sure, but recreation is increasingly the dominant form of use. But anyway, 109 mentions by 39 respondents. That was lack of priority. This is the second big challenge, the big sort of wicked sub-problem. And this has to do with the fact that a lot of times we don't prioritize our freshwater fisheries very highly. And that can be for good reason, for bad reason. Here, if there's going to be growth, the critical activities involve quantifying and communicating freshwater fishery value, essentially demonstrating that there is a lack of priority where that is the case, and in those instances at least advocating for our fisheries to receive their fair share, which often cases they're not. Also strategically and with other innovations we can optimize what little we have in some cases. Scope was a third persistent challenge, mentioned 108 times by 43 respondents, and this has to do with how much and how widely are our freshwater fisheries managers looking? Are they looking at agriculture too, or are they, essentially in Canada this means how far do considerations extend beyond just fishery abundance and health? Are we looking at things on the land? Are we looking in a sophisticated way at fishery use? And there's, at least in the academic community, lots of calls for, say, ecosystem management. And this is, a major topic of discussion that I guess I could spend more time on. But long story short, scope isn't always ideal. It's what's practical. There's some opportunities again for growth with novel technologies, boosting routine activities, I would say, developing practical guidelines, and investing in data management systems that can keep pace with the data that we're collecting. Competing interests, this is very similar to the last one. It has to do with the fact that fisheries as a public service, or fisheries management, I should say, has to compete with things like healthcare. And as this respondent pointed out, if it's fisheries, or let's say a field tech versus an MRI machine, we really shouldn't be surprised that freshwater fisheries don't come out on top in those cases. So I think the opportunities for growth here involve working better within this reality. And in cases where these competing interest scenarios are unrightfully favoring things other than fisheries, we need to be on the providers of funding and resources. Political inconstancy, this is another really good example of one that's outside of the freshwater fisheries manager's purview, but I think progress here will rely on some form of greater stability across governments. One of the problems we've had in Canada is that as we change federal governments, we see things like our habitat provisions in our Fisheries Act go from very strong to very weak to very strong, and we bounce back and forth, and we don't manage habitat very effectively as a result. So this is a tough one, but all I'm trying to point out in some of these is where there's the opportunity for growth. I don't want to be too prescriptive, one, because I can't, two, because it doesn't seem appropriate, at least for me or someone in my position to be doing that. But I'll go on to the next one, socio-ecological complexity. For anybody who's from Australia, this will probably be pretty intuitive too, because like Canada, you have vast freshwater fisheries, they're numerous, and the people who use them are similarly numerous and diverse. So this is a tough thing to capture. Like, freshwater fisheries managers don't tend to have a ton of resources at their disposal, and capturing this is very difficult. In the Canadian context, the way we manage people is improving, but it remains very scientifically non-rigorous. So there's a big opportunity for progress there. We need to account for social and ecological unknowns in our long-term and short-term strategies. And one thing we can really improve in Canada too is the links between planners and managers, managers being regulators. There's a lot more or I would say in the marine fisheries context, this is more advanced and there's some lessons to be learned, but at least in Canada with our freshwater fisheries, we don't do a great job of that. Limited tools, and this has less to do with tangible tools and more to do with limited legal authorities and the fact that, you know, it's similar to what I said about scope. Freshwater fisheries managers are beholden to activities like agriculture and yet in many cases don't have a lot of power to influence what's going on the land. So that's difficult. Those divisions within natural resource management, though, I think it's important to say exist for good reason. They break things up, they simplify things, and they allow us to, in isolation, you know, do a pretty good job managing something like agriculture. But when the links between those players are, you know, fractured or suboptimal, the stuff that's literally downstream is what suffers most. In which, you know, in this case, that's freshwater fisheries. So, social capital, it's something I mentioned a couple times here, but investing in that, and I would say, you know, more than specific investments, just appreciating that and its importance is, yeah, that's where we have opportunities to grow here. Geographies and scale, similar one. I won't spend too much time on this, but again, freshwater fisheries managers have a lot in front of them. It's difficult to capture and sort of, you know, manage effectively. And the ways that we've progressed here, at least in Canada in the past, have been with various innovations, whether those are technologies or strategic shifts, you know, from a water body specific approach to a broad scale approach. There are opportunities for growth there that I've highlighted. Reactivity, this is more, maybe more a result than a challenge itself, but it was brought up again the number of times that you can see here. And this just has to do with getting behind and not being proactive and sort of constantly lagging behind the problems that we see. Again, accounting for unknown unknowns, that's important, strengthening those links between planners and managers, and making sure that our plans are sufficiently flexible. Those are the keys. The final one has to do with intersectoral frictions. This is more like, you know, tensions or gaps, disjuncture between, say, academia and management, and the fact that we're not always on the same page or we're not working harmoniously toward the goal of sustainable freshwater fisheries. Again, social capital is key here. Those links between divisions of natural resource management are really important. But I won't talk too much about those things specifically. They deserve more time than I can give them. The result of all this is what I've taken to call in, because a couple other people use this terminology, chronic incapacity. So we have, you know, we have a few resources to do what we need to do, but when you factor in those limitations, there's a lot less that we can do, at least compared to what would be ideal. And another reason that we find ourselves in the position we do is that these challenges, these wild problems, as I sort of called them already, they interact with one another, and that's bad news, but it can also be good news, as I'm going to discuss in a second here. What ends up happening with a lot of our freshwater fisheries is they end up in triage mode. So managers are reacting to situations. In medicine, triage is all about rationing care according to the perceived level of urgency, and this is when things go bad. And at least in the case of Canada, this is how we're managing a ton of our freshwater fisheries. So there are good reasons for us to want to transcend this, but it's a very, very difficult thing to do. I mentioned that these problems interact with each other, and the good news about that is that we alleviate strain in one area and we create the potential for growth in adjacent areas. So supportive contributions of this kind can allow managers the freedom to do more, but also envision ways to do differently or better. Basically, when it comes to our products as scientists, whether those are tools, information, the costs of adoption need to be essentially near zero as long as we're in these triage management scenarios, because you need to be able to improve quickly without lagging behind in the short term. You know, we can't take a 5-year step back just for a little bit of marginal progress 20 years from now. This is just a summary of all of these things I've highlighted. I won't read over them for obvious reasons, but what really makes all of those persistent challenges similar is their defiance of conventional problem solving. Things like advocacy and basic science, as important as they are, they're somewhat limited when it comes to addressing these. And if I'm doing anything today, I guess I'm pitching the importance of ingenuity and taking a different approach to some of these things, because a lot of the knowledge action gap that we talk about has more to do with the fact that we're just figuring out how to solve some of these problems, which are, you know, wild in nature and which we don't really have much precedent for. And I think the next step for me and anybody else who's interested in that is to go into some of these things here and take the approach that I did to this whole thing and really zoom in on those things, do some in-depth troubleshooting. And that's all for me.
Very well timed. Thanks a lot, Andrew. We might move straight on to the next presentation. He's Samuel Blyth from Uppsala University in Sweden, and he's going to talk to us about comparing the expectations of coastal sea trout anglers with real catches. So I think he has to click on that.
I think we're already lined up.
Yep. Okay, cool.
All right. We are. There we go. I've got it.
Got it?
Yep.
It's not up there though.
Isn't it? All right, great. Got slides. Thank you for the introduction. I'm really excited to be presenting this work. This is essentially the third chapter of a multi-year project I've been working on with a particular recreational fishery located in the Baltic, tying together the human and biological components of what's going on with this particular fishery. I'm going to start by giving just a bit of context for how this specific coastal fishery is managed and what management objectives we're looking at and what knowledge gaps we're trying to bridge currently, and some of the key findings that we've got around linking together the people who are fishing, what their expectations are and their preferences are, and how that relates to their actual catches and the spawning population of this fish. So, as mentioned, I live and work in Sweden. I'm based on the island of Gotland out in the middle of the Baltic. And here, the coastal fisheries are open access, so there's no license required. Anybody can go fishing there. Limited regulations set by the regional and national government. And around Gotland in particular, a lot of the coastal fishing is focused on a single species, for which angling is being promoted as a means to draw more tourists to the island outside of the peak summer tourist season, and to have this more use of a renewable resource that we have. The fish that people are targeting are big sea-run brown trout. In this area, the genetics of the fish and also some of the environmental characteristics, it's not overly saline. There's reasonably good prey availability in the coastal area, allows the fish to get quite large. And this draws a lot of very avid anglers who want challenging fishing experience to come to this fishery and try and catch these fish. But although it's being promoted to get more people in, we're missing a bit of data on what's actually happening in this fishery. We've got limited stock assessment data, and although catch and release is happening at quite a high rate, in a couple of studies we've done, we're looking at around 85% of catches of sea trout being released. But what we want to know now is the fish that are being kept, are there particular fish that are being targeted, and do these harvest patterns actually matter for the long-term sustainability of this? How do the angler preferences and their choices for which fish they want match up with what they're actually catching? And what does that mean for which fish are coming back into the streams on the island to reproduce? So I'm working with a few sets of data. The first is material on angler preferences from a creel survey that I did in 2018. And this is extra data that adds on to a paper that I've already published as part of my PhD thesis. And then catch data for a sample of almost 200 sea trout, measuring their size, whether they've recently reproduced, a number of other characteristics. And then some new data, or data that hasn't been published before. The catch stuff's part of a stress response to catch and release study I've already gotten out. Coming from 3 of the spawning streams on the island. These are mostly ephemeral streams that will dry up in the summer that these fish are coming into to reproduce, and are particularly important as there's no hatchery fish being released around this island, and so they're supporting most of the population of fish that people are trying to catch. So starting with the people and what they're wanting to get out of this, they're quite accurate in their expectations to come to Gotland and catch big sea trout. The average size of fish is over 50 centimeters, and their expectation of how much of their catches are going to be in that size range, we're quite on the ball. But they're significantly underestimating the proportion of catches that are wild fish and how much this natural reproduction supports the population. And I won't get into it, but I also did some testing of avid anglers' ability to accurately assess the size of their catches, which can have some impact or some implications for changing size limits and stuff like that. But you can ask me about that later if you want to know more. Now, as you would expect if you know much about fisheries biology and things, it's quite common for the females to be larger than the males, and that's the case. They're significantly larger in the spawning fish that we have. As well as in the catch data, the fish that showed evidence of having recently reproduced were significantly larger than the other catches that were made. Sorry, I can use the laser, but it's a bit of a tricky angle. But the biggest fish, the ones that are more important for reproducing and maintaining the genetic characteristics of these big fish people want to catch, are the females. And so we want to know, what are the people catching these fish doing with those particularly valuable individuals? So taking some of the survey data can break down some of their harvest preferences based on size characteristics of their catches. And for the anglers that I have information from, 37% favored keeping particularly large and nice fish, whether this is for a trophy or the ones they thought they'd be more desirable to eat. Whereas 22% wanted to keep some of their catch, but would choose not to keep a particularly big fish. Their choice would be to keep one that's legal, but not the biggest, nicest sea trout. And when I started overlaying these percentages onto the actual size classes of the catches being made in this fishery, came across a wonderful coincidence that if I used 60 centimeters as a nice round number as a cutoff to say anything bigger than that counts as particularly large and nice, if 30% of 37% of catches of those bigger fish are harvested, and 22% of the fish between the 50 centimeter minimum and 60 are harvested, it would equal exactly the 15% retention rate that we found in our other studies for this fishery. And so, great, we've got a wonderful starting point for evaluating what would happen if we changed the regulations in this fishery or changed angler preferences for what they're harvesting. And what would that look like if we want to move forward with changing what's happening in this fishery and maybe do a bit more to protect these particularly big fish. So here I've got a figure that kind of gives you a bit of a visualization of which fish are being taken out. Here's the current scenario. The gray section at the bottom, these are the under 50 centimeters, so it's been shortened. Presumably all of those are released. In the middle we have the between 50 and 60 centimeter fish that are being caught, and this would be the portion that are retained. And at the top, those biggest fish, 37% being the dark orange, currently being harvested or identified as desirable for harvest by the anglers in this fishery. Now, if we changed from the current scenario and adjusted the regulations to have a size window or bump up the minimum size to 60 centimeters, we'd change those harvest numbers. If we're keeping the same number of fish being taken out, it would look more like this. So size windows, at least in a 1 year period, would protect those largest fish, but you see that if we're taking out the same number, then we've got quite a big chunk of that middle section coming out. And if that was happening year after year, your size window might end up reducing the portion of fish that make it to that bigger size. And similarly, bumping up the minimum size limit to 60 centimeters, there's going to be a huge pressure on those biggest female spawning fish in this population. So neither of these scenarios, I think, would be an ideal change in this fishery, and they're quite drastic and a little bit extreme. And so also, these are things that are hard to enforce in most recreational fisheries. Regulation changes, although they look good on paper, they may not translate. But if we were to change the angler's preferences for which fish they're taking, a softer change that's maybe less extreme, we can see some significant changes in the proportions as well, but not as dramatic or as drastic. So here, just for visualization, this is if the preference for taking out the bigger fish decreased or increased by 5%, what it would look like. And in running the numbers on this, even if it was less than 2%, between 1% and 2%, it would be a significant change from the current scenario of what's going on, that we could reduce it by 2% and you'd still have a significant increase in the number of big fish, but you'd have flexibility around the opportunities for selective harvest, that people could still choose to take out the big fish that's bleeding heavily and not going to survive, but protect a little bit more of those bigger important fish. And then similarly, if just overall release rates increased or decreased by 5%, you can see how that compares to the current scenario, and that this helps to visualize what could happen as more people are being encouraged to participate in this fishery. If they're keeping the same preferences for which size of fish they're retaining, how much might we have to shift things to be able to keep more of these bigger fish there that are important for maintaining what's drawing people into this fishery in the first place. And so the results of this work illustrate the importance of these large sea trout for being the ones that are having the genetics to grow big and get people here in the first place, but that they are also the females and this key part of the ones that are actively reproducing, but that those fish are targeted by some selective harvest pressure as things currently stand. And it makes sense. If you're going to feed a lot of people, a big fish is nice for that. I understand. But if this, as more people fish, increases and reduces the number of those big fish, we could see this fishery change from one that's able to have lots of people participating in it to one that is less sustainable in the future. And that in the context of what's possible to do to actually change the sustainability of the fishery or maintain it, that changing regulations can be hard to do and hard to enforce, but if we can achieve just small changes to angler preference, we could have long-term good and relatively large impacts just from small changes in what people are doing. Moving forward from this relates to some of the work that we're doing around improving angler behavior with catch and release in this fishery. And we're doing some outreach and messaging around improving best practices and including information just on the importance of these big fish for the role they have in the spawning population and the role they have in keeping big fish there to catch. If we are bundling that in with our best practices information, we can see whether it's being adopted or not, whether or not we need to increase campaigns and education around that. We can see where that goes. And just from a building on the numbers side of it, I'd like to do some expansion on those population models and predictions, because the figures I've got up here are just what happens just in a single year's catches. How does that play into multiple year impacts on which fish are surviving catch and release and their growth rates and things like that. And so with that, I'd like to thank you very much for choosing to be here and your attention, and I'd love to answer any questions now or later if we've got time.
So we've got a few minutes for questions, if there's any from the floor. That doesn't look like it. So you've I think you might have touched on that in that last slide, but you haven't thought about doing some additional scenarios there where you look at different release survival rates and how extra work and effort you put into education might alter the balance there, and you take that.
So in the previous stuff I've done in this fishery, I've got one paper out. One side of the project was looking at what the anglers who are fishing here were thinking was important and what they were saying they were doing when they're handling and releasing fish. And then the next round was go out and actually test that and see which of the things they're doing or not doing actually result in higher stress levels in the fish. We don't have good long-term survival numbers, but the potential for survival from catch and release in this fishery, because it's cold water, you're not bringing them up on the boat or on shore usually, should be quite high. And we've identified a few areas to help make things better that way. So we've got some of that information already there to be built on, but then to incorporate it more into the models and to actually crack that and get multi-year predictions of what things would look like with a 2%, 4%, 6% mortality. I have some of that in a more complicated table that I didn't think was worth putting on here because too many numbers and stuff, but that will go into this paper. I've got some of that just incorporating release mortality and the mortality from the under 50 centimeter fish in there just to make these numbers look a bit more robust. But yeah, this is the simplified version for ease of reading. Yeah.
Any other questions from the floor?
Just a quick one. In your surveys, did you find any indication of trophy hunters?
So in this fishery, I mean, the release rate is quite high. There are, I'm trying to remember the exact percentage, but the people who were wanting to keep the big ones as a trophy, that played into the particularly large and nice. I incorporated that percent into the 37. But it wasn't a major motivation, and a lot of the people coming here wanted to catch a very big fish, really high release rates. They're more likely to keep that fish if it shows signs of not surviving, things like that. It's in this particular fishery, you're looking at very avid anglers who are in their fishing trajectory are moving beyond the major consumptive orientation. You'll have a week of people coming to the island, or 5 people coming for a week, and they'll keep 1 fish between them to eat as a group, and that'll be mid-sized trout. Less people going and wanting to take home a particularly big one. They'll want to get a picture with it, but less people trying to keep the really, really big ones.
Is there a permanent population on the island?
60,000 people, 60,000, and then a lot of tourists in the summer. But
so you'd say the bulk of the effort is from residents?
Fishing, I can't remember the numbers off the top of my head. Gosha might remember. She was involved in a study breaking down how many percentage of the population that are tourist anglers versus residents. So a lot of tourists coming to fish, and so seasonally a lot of pressure from tourist anglers. But I can find those numbers for you if you really want to know. I've got them.
Might make for some challenges in the education work.
Yeah, and also with it being an open access fishery, even international people don't have to buy a license. So where do you get the information to them? So that's part of the thing. They've started a web page with communication of this stuff for the fishery, but it's not something people have to look at. And so how do you get that in front of them? Do we advertise it on the ferries, on the airplanes, for the couple thousand people coming out of several 100,000 that come as tourists overall? Yeah, stuff to work on.
No worries. Well, join me in thanking Sam again for an excellent presentation. Excellent. Thanks for that. Doing my job for me.
Thanks. I think I'm needed.
So our next speaker today is Kevin Haase from the Institute of Baltic Sea Fisheries in Rostock, Germany. He's going to talk to us about fisheries management interventions for cod.
Yeah, thanks for the introduction and welcome to my presentation about fisheries management intervention for cod in the Western Baltic Sea. As we are in Australia and far away from Germany, I want to start with some background. So the Baltic Sea is located in the center of Europe, and cod is an ecological key species in the area as it is the main predator. But additionally, it's the main target species from the commercial and also from the recreational fisheries. And the stock has collapsed dramatically in the recent years. So we can see here the stock decline from the late 90s, and now we are below this biological reference points. One reason for the stock collapse was a high fishing pressure and high removals, especially from the commercial fisheries. So in an attempt to reduce these removals, the quotas from the commercial fisheries were decreased, which we can see here in the light gray area. On the other side, the recreational catches were quite stable over the time, a little bit fluctuating. But this management led to a situation here where the recreational catches had a high share from the total catches. And the stock, as you've seen before, has not recovered. So managers decided to split the burden of stock rebuilding and introduced a back limit for the recreational fisheries. So here you can see how the back limit developed over the years. So we started with a 3 cod per day back limit in February, March, which is the spawning time of cod, and 5 in the remaining year. Then it got a little bit relaxed because we got a good 2016 year class, and afterwards it get tightened again due to the stock collapse. But what is really interesting here is that this first back limit that we had here in 2017 was estimated to reduce only the German catches in this case by 900 tons. But the next years in our data from the on-site survey and so on revealed a real reduction from 1,900 tons, so that it's more than double than expected. And obvious, we have to ask ourselves what happened here. So we looked into the German fishery and what changed, and we found some quite obvious changes. I mean, of course, when you introduce a back limit, the harvest rates decrease because you don't allow the fishers to take so much. But also here we can see the harvest rates over the years, and we can see that it's most of the time declined with a decreasing back limit. So in 2019 we was a little bit more relaxed, the rates are higher. But here in 2017 the harvest rates were extraordinarily low, which could be due to the stock collapse that was not really shown. And we also saw an increase of the release rate in the high catch fisheries, so in the sea-based fisheries, private boats and charter boats. This was also expected, especially because we have this good 2016 year class that grow into the fishery, and there were so many small fish at the time, or more small fish than usually. But then we found some unexpected changes, and the first one was that zero catch days, so the percentage of zero catch days just increased in 2017, which lead obviously to this higher reproduction. But another thing that occurred were a decreased number in the participation rate of the anglers, so fishers don't board a license anymore, and the travel distances decreased. So fishers, especially from the south of Germany, that came as non-residents, as tourists to the coast, don't come anymore. This can be especially good seen in the charter boat fishery, which is characterized with this high catch rates and a high percentage of non-residents. And here, especially in 2017, you can see that the number of charter boat anglers decreased a lot, probably as a shock to that the back limit was first introduced, because the back limit is not in regular regulation in Germany. It's really uncommon. And also we see here that the maximum travel distance decreased after the back limit was introduced. So that's the tourists that don't come anymore. And this has obviously negative consequences and economic losses for coastal communities, for the charter boat organizations, and so on. Another thing we saw, and that's a quite complex graph, so it's a monthly fishing effort basically, and we can see in this time, in the February, March, where we have the stricter spawning regulations, that the bars got smaller, so the effort decreased when the stricter times have. And outside of this regulation, so the months before and the months later, the effort increased. So the effort shifted. They still want to catch spawning cod at the spawning aggregations, but they just do it shortly before or shortly after the stricter season. When we now look at it out of a management perspective, you could say, okay, the higher reduction of the catches is a good thing with a collapsed stock, because you just reduce the fishing effort even more, or the fishing pressure even more. But the goal of recreational fisheries management should also be to keep social and economic values, and this is obviously not the case when the fishers don't come to the coast anymore. So our next goal was to figure out how we can maybe better manage the cod fishery without so strong impacts on the angler welfare. So basically the first step was to ask anglers what they think about regulations. And here you can see that minimum landing size and spawning closures are better seen by anglers than the back limit. So there's a higher percentage of this blue area, which is a bad response. And then, and that was the main part of the publication I present here, is to calculate the reproduction potential of different regulations, with the assumption that the angler behavior stays the same, so no decrease in participation rate or anything like that. And that's why you don't have to remember every number or even see every number, just some key points. Here the back limit, and especially the stricter back limit, have the highest potential to reduce the catches, but they also affect most of the fishing days on the other side, and therefore affect most of the anglers. On the other hand, like spawning closures have much smaller potential to reduce the catches, and also minimum landing sizes are not increased so much, or slot limits that are really high don't reduce the catches so much, but they don't affect anglers so much, and they have positive effects on the stock, like when you close the spawning completely, the spawning is not disturbed anymore, or when you increase the minimum landing size, cod can spawn twice a year, twice in their life, for example. So what we came up is a combination of measures. So we had a high back limit here to just say, okay, it is an endless resource. You can't fill your fridge till it's run over. You don't need more than 10 cod. And then different regulations for land and sea-based fishing, as sea-based fishing is the only fishery that really come to the spawning area because they spawn in deep areas and deep waters. And also we have a low post-release mortality in the sea-based fisheries, so we can increase the minimum landing size here. Land-based, they can't reach the spawning areas, so why should we close them in the spawning time? And they have probably high post-release mortality, so it's not a good idea to increase the minimum landing size here. But this combination would come up to a similar reduction than the 5 cod per day back limit, but with positive effects of a real spawning closure, a higher minimum landing size, and lesser impacts on the angler welfare. So to sum it up, the introduced back limit changed the angler behavior with economic losses for the fishery, or consequences at least, and a combination of regulation have the same reproduction potential, but with proposed lower impacts on angler welfare and positive effects on the stock. So that were our experience with back limits in Germany. As I told already, back limit is a really uncommon regulation in Germany. We only have it for salmon, so really high value species, basically. So maybe you can evaluate. I saw in Australia here in Victoria, you have basically for every species a back limit. So the angler will probably react completely different, and maybe we can talk about what your experience are with back limits, or with what your experience are with angler behavior responses to different regulations. Thank you that you're here.
So guys, do we have any questions from the floor? Okay.
Super lucky. Yeah.
Yeah, I think your situation is quite interesting because, as you mentioned, in Australia, bag limits are very common.
Yeah.
What we tend to do with them is set and forget, which is arguably also not fantastic. So we essentially put in what is a relatively static bag limit.
Mm-hmm.
Right? It's just the same bag limit for an extended period of time, and then we may adjust that after many years.
Yeah.
Yours appear to be quite dynamic in that, you know, 1 year you brought in what was quite a substantial reduction from 10 to 3, I think. Is that right?
No, it was from you can catch as much as you want and keep as much. So there was no back limit, and then 5 directly.
To quite a substantial one. Yeah, and then you
that was a big shock
later on.
Yeah.
Two questions, I guess. The first is, was there much of an effort from management to try and soften the blow? Or was there much of an effort to try and educate and soften the blow of that introduction? And then the second is there any consideration of keeping more static bag limits in future so that the changes are not up and down all the time?
Okay, maybe I start with the second one first.
Yeah.
I think the EU management, they really want to have an instrument that they can regulate up and down as a response to new, and that's why they choose the back limit basically, because you can easily go up and down. Minimum landing size should be relatively fixed because you have like the biological information why you set it. So I don't think that will change because we have this yearly calculations what can be caught by the commercial and recreational fisheries, and then they regulate it up and down. And to the first question, I think it was definitely a big shock for the fishery, and especially for the recreational fisheries, because they were not used to such a regulation. And I think it was mainly just a policy decision, because otherwise you would have to close the commercial fishery nearly completely due to the bad stock status. Now you have closed the commercial fisheries, so now you don't have a commercial fishery anymore, so the cod stock is really in a bad situation in the Western Baltic Sea. And now you see also that the angler get more used to it. So after 3 years, we got the information from anglers or from charter boat drivers that with the 7 bag limit, the anglers are fine with it. They understand that the cod stock is in a bad situation. But yeah, it was really drastical, and I think also a really quick situation. So we don't really have this education that we maybe needed to the anglers, and it was just a big shock that also lead to this participation decrease, for example.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think your argument about a dynamic bag limit for recreational fishers is something I've been jumping up and down a bit for a while, but it has very little traction in Australia because of these shocks that and the lack of uptake. Your lag in your effect of your dynamic change is going to be much longer potentially than a commercial operation. So anyway, really interesting stuff. Thank you.
Thanks. So we got a minute or two. I just had one more question for you, Kevin. With the spawning closure, is that a closure on targeted effort or just a closure on take? And if it's the targeted, if it's the take, then what effect does catch and release have on the spawning of the animals?
So you have a really low diversity of target species in the Baltic Sea. It's just only cod, basically. You have salmon and sea trout, as we saw before, but that are completely other fisheries. So for salmon, you have the trawling fishery, and for sea trout is really coastal fishery, and cod is only spawning in like 20-meter plus areas. There are not so many 20-meter plus areas in the Baltic at all, at least in the Western Baltic. So you can quite good say when someone go out with a boat and drive all the way, they only can catch cod, basically, and so it's more an effort restriction. But you can still go there and try to catch something else. But
so it sounds like it would create a difficult situation for your compliance officers, your enforcement officers, because anyone can be there fishing, perhaps for sea trout or cod or whatever, and just say, oh no, I'm not targeting the species that's closed.
Yeah, there were just a big discussion about this compliance thing, but I think the spawning closure is quite good seen by the angler, and we have it all over Germany. We have it for trout in rivers and for pike and stuff like that in rivers or the lakes also, and they really apply to it there. So I think also for the cod fishery, the compliance would be high in this case.
Okay. Join me in thanking Kevin. So everyone left in the room, that concludes our first session for this afternoon, and we're back here after afternoon tea for the remaining 5 talks and group discussion. Thank you.